Lopez to introduce me
You just go to the restroom, I think.
with a long
Good time.
sort of introduction about why you should listen. But the simple fact is, I'm just a history teacher. I'm not, I taught a lot of German history, I don't really know it very well. Taught a lot of military, I don't know that very well. Taught the whole scale of Western Civ, and I'm just beginning to fit some of that together after 60 years of it. So the only expertise I really have here is I was at the mine in, I'll say, in Austria in 1945 for, I don't know, 3 weeks or something like that, when the art which was there, and which is the center of this movie, The Monuments Men, was being examined and prepared to be shipped back down to whoever owned it. And with that, let me see if I can speak sitting down and still be heard. Is that okay, Brian? I made up a little set of notes here that had the headings at the top of the 2 titles, The Monuments Men, which triggered a lot of this. The better book, I think, in many ways, following it, The Rape of Europa by Lynn Nicholas. And at the bottom of that, or halfway down, I started a discussion about the notion of the Nazis and stolen art. I think that it's easy to sort of criticize the Nazis for almost anything. They become the punching bag of choice, I think, and in some cases a straw man of choice, but they still were extremely wicked. If I have to nominate somebody who's wickeder, I would say Joe Stalin. But for a lot of political reasons, he doesn't get the recognition as the first man up whenever you're trying to think about the worst person in recent history. Talking about the way in which the Nazis stole art would be kind of fun, but I want to start with something I put in here. One of the things that happened in my own experience with a rifle company and with an anti-tank company in Patton's Third Army was that even in France, we stole some things, and there were some men who were involved in rape charges. What we stole from the French ordinarily was something that we thought we could use and should use for their benefit. It was always the way we explained it to ourselves, but because I served on 57mm anti-tank guns, the old British 6-pounder gun, which was completely ineffective, but it had one great use to it. It was towed by a truck which carried us around, and you could carry junk on it. One of the things that I stole almost immediately was some farmers' pick and shovel, because we had those pitiful little army-issue picks and shovels to dig with, and they're trying to dig in a 57mm gun, which run from here to Dr. Cohn's. By the time the trails are spread, you need something effective to deal with. So it's simply saying that I didn't steal anything that we shouldn't be using. I didn't mind doing that. Once we got to Germany, there was a looting impulse in every rifle company with which I happened to serve in some sort of attack as you moved into a German town. Once the attack died down and the shooting was briefly suspended, their thoughts almost always turned to looting. And they quoted some of the comments in here. That a person would scream, you know, I get this room, I get the dining room, I get the bedroom, whatever. And that's literally what happened. So when we look at the Monuments Men and think about the Nazis stealing the art and what a tut-tut bad thing that was, sure it was a bad thing to do. But it's kind of a question of just be careful about casting the first stone. Occupying armies have probably always done this kind of thing, informal looting. The Russians, I mentioned in here, have their own monuments team, and they used, I think, a very typically brutal Soviet expression about doing that. They call their monuments people the trophy team. In other words, we're just going to go steal this stuff, and it's all going to go to Leningrad, and half of you have been there, I think, and seen it. You see them there. With absolutely no apologies, and that's the way they felt about the war. And if you go through the history and the way the Nazis acted when they invaded Germany or invaded Russia, the terrible things they did while they were there, I think you can understand the absolute rage that the Russians had against the Germans. And that's not an excuse for it, but it's certainly an explanation for, amongst other things, the literally almost mechanical, but certainly highly dedicated program of rape that occurred when the Russian soldiers came into Germany. There was just untold a number of stories about that, and 99% of them I think are probably true. Given that, what was the Monuments Men all about? Somewhere before the Second World War, there was an international agreement that people really ought to be worried about the destructive nature of modern war, and that if you want to see an example of that, Reims Cathedral was badly damaged by shell fire, mostly German shell fire, in the First World War. And it took them the whole period between the wars to begin to reconstruct it. And things like that made a lot of people think, well, we really ought to do something about not destroying the entire countryside and not destroying these great monuments to art, architecture, and so on, unless we absolutely have to. In the Second World War, the chief inspiration for that sort of thinking, I think, is the monastery church at Monte Cassino in south central Italy. That is on a mountain which controls several, from a military point of view, controls several mountain passes and so on, a critical military objective, and whoever held Monte Cassino could dominate the high ground around there for miles around. Eventually, that thing was simply bombed to the point where most of the church on top of it was destroyed, and some of the inner buildings. The bottom of that, the rooms at the absolute bottom of the monastery in Monte Cassino, were so deep into the mountains and so well protected that the monks survived down there, even during the bombing. And there was something like, I forget how many thousand pounds of bombs dropped, literally, on this place. It was a lot smaller than this campus. So for the monks to survive gives you an idea how sturdy the whole structure was and how deep down their safety areas must have been. But it's still a matter of regret that was done. And people thought, is there some way to get around this? And this awareness of this kind of thing certainly occupied the mind of President Roosevelt. It was on the mind of General Eisenhower, and certainly on the mind of the Air Force people. But on the other hand, they had the idea that something has to be done to get around Monte Cassino as a military objective, and so it's too bad, but we had to bomb it. And that got a lot of people thinking about what should we do about this sort of thing afterward. So the Monuments Men, as told in a lot of the organization of the movie, and certainly in the book, The Monuments Men, is pretty objective, I think, and pretty accurate. We needed something to guarantee some of these works of art which were going to be destroyed or could be lost one way or the other. And so the Monuments Men grew out of that. They are in response, in a way, to what the Allies knew about a very definite program that Hitler had to simply confiscate or buy as cheaply as possible, or to steal, in any case, anything he could get in the way of whatever amounts to art, whether it's beautiful library books, statuettes, paintings, whatever they might possibly be. And so he decided that after the Second World War was won, and the Third Reich was well along on its way toward its 1,000-year career, that the old Austrian city of Linz, L-I-N-Z, where he had spent a lot of time as a kid, would be turned into a museum city, and a lot of it would be changed. And the Monuments Men movie, as I recall, opens with a panorama of the model of that Monuments Men, or rather the Hitler's renovated Linz. There's a program set up to acquire art, particularly just taking away from Jews, just execute the Jews and take their entire art collection, force others to sell to him very cheap prices, a whole program. And the idea then that would be something that Hitler wanted to do, because he was, if you'll recall, a professional artist, or wanted to be a professional artist and architect, and actually sketched very well. The idea that led to the notion that one of the ways to gain favor with Hitler would be to somehow or other acquire famous paintings, pieces of sculpture, and so on, and present them to him. And the people who did this, as literally a part of their job, as they saw it, were people like Himmler, who was in charge of the police forces and also had his own private army. Ribbentrop, propaganda minister. The most famous one was the nominal second in command, but actually wasn't entrusted with any sort of office job at all. Goering, the head of the Air Force. He himself knew a bit about art. He himself had a castle residence outside of Berlin and was collecting on his own account. But he also realized that if he could find the odd Raphael or something and present it to Hitler from time to time, that this would be a good PR gesture. Himmler did the same thing on behalf of the Schutzstaffel, the SS, Ribbentrop, the others. I think there were 4 or 5 professional collectors who were simply told, jump in your Volkswagen and run around and find, confiscate, steal, acquire this stuff any way you possibly can. That whole process was voracious enough in itself, but the real need to hide German art and all their other treasures away was the U.S. and the Allied Air Forces. We began an actual program of just destroying the 50 most populous, most important cities in Germany. And they were on a shopping list, just like the maintenance crew. Things to do, go fix the swimming pool. Go bomb Lamberg into nothing. Same to Nuremberg. I was in Nuremberg for a brief moment in the spring of '45 before the war ended, and you could literally look across from one side of that famous old city to the other. And there were nothing except the shells of buildings in Nuremberg in 1945, in the inner city. That bombing campaign was so complete that sometime in April, I think it was, 45, the Air Force had run out of their list. They had destroyed the heart of 50 of the most important German cities. For the rifle troops, that meant that if you wanted to have an Air Force guy come around and bomb something for you, they'd say, sure. You know, we had the afternoon off anyway. And they destroyed particularly, this is in May, or in April, or March. One small town in western Germany, quite close to the Rhine Valley, that was holding up an advance that my regiment was making. And we just stopped there in the evening, and I could see in my own mind our colonel simply calling up the Air Force and saying, if you're not doing anything tomorrow, would you just blow the center out of this entire town? And they did. And so instead of fighting for it, we just drove around it or drove through what the rest of the wreckage was. That was typical of what was happening. And so the monuments men had their challenges, and they certainly had plenty of places to look, because the Nazis had decided that they were going to face this challenge of the air forces and so on by dispersing the art. And so you see in the movies, you see in the film, and you see it, read it as you read the book, very good description of the way in which mines were picked out because they were deep, they were usually dry. The thing you want there is a salt mine, good humidity, and a constant temperature. And so a lot of these are salt mines, but they used other kinds of mines too, and that's depicted very well. And then they would disperse this stuff to these places. They also had a serious campaign, and you see this in the movie, to take as much of French art as they possibly could. And that is the part played in the movie by the young woman Palan from one of the major Parisian art galleries. And she also should be mentioned, and it doesn't really talk about this in the film, I think. She spent 4 years in the French resistance. So she was living literally in the same buildings with the Nazis, talking to them for 4 years and betraying every possible thing that she could to them, to the Allies and to the French resistance, and they would then send it on to de Gaulle or to the British or the Americans in England. Now this is a story that was more than worthy of its own movie. I've made something of a fairly decent study of the French resistance, And the usual story is people joined the resistance, say, at the beginning of the year, and by the end of the year, they'd been discovered, tortured, and killed. And then a new year would start over. So you have 40 to 41, and then they end up 44 to 45. And there are very few people who went through the whole period of the war in the French resistance and were very active, who survived it. The Nazis were very good about picking these people up. So the Milan part is an interesting one, and she was extremely brave, and it should be mentioned when you're thinking about her and the way in which the movie presents her. She is portrayed as keeping a careful list of all the trains that left Paris loaded with French art, and apparently she did do that. And she also carried on this resistance business. One of the things she did very successfully was disguise the fact that she knew German very well. So when the Germans thought that they were talking German amongst themselves and she wouldn't understand, Rose Valland understood. And she just fed the Allies an immense amount of really first-rate intel. The fact that she survived it always is shocking, literally, when you read the history of the resistance. Most of the resistance, by definition, would be amateur. And it's amateurs who kill themselves and amateurs who make mistakes. And they did over and over and over. My favorite story on that is some British officer from one of the resistance services, SAS or something in England, either parachuted into the area around Marseille in southern France or was put ashore by a small boat. Went into Marseille, got in touch with the French resistance. That night and for days afterward, the resistance paraded him up and down from one bar to the other saying, "This is our British friend who's here to help us win the war." And illustrates not only the naivete, I think, of those people, but also the danger of that sort of enthusiasm. And the enthusiastic amateur can be a real problem sometimes. What happened with the art and the other treasures? The best portrayal in the film of what was actually happening is the scene where they show you the German national gold treasure in the mine at Merkers, M-E-R-K-E-R-S. That is, I was never there, but I've seen a lot of pictures of it through the years. That's the best sort of portrayal in the whole movie of that art. There's a vast echoing chamber down in this mine in Merkers, and all the German gold from the German National Gold Treasury, all the real cash that they had in English, French notes, or whatever it was, American money, is all down there. And that's the way it is in the movie. It's just exactly the way it looks in all the professional photographs from 1945. Maybe in photography, Clooney and the rest of them were simply able to superimpose some other things that they wanted on a background scene actually shot at Merkers in 45. I don't know. I can only tell you that as far as the mine is concerned, and in terms of my own experience, the scene in Alt-Aussay, where the Steinberg mine, the mine at Alt-Aussay, which had the greatest amount of the most famous paintings and sculptures and so on, is absolutely useless in terms of any kind of reality. And for one thing, there are no Russians at Alt-Aussay. They could have been, because it was a sort of fluid situation where you went where you could go. Patton always wanted to go to Berlin, and I had to keep telling him, no, we've agreed that Berlin will be split up later and the Russians are going to be there first anyway. George Patton, I think, still wanted to go Berlin. The Ruskies obviously wanted to get to Vienna, but they also were quite willing to drift further on into the Salzkammergut, the area there where the mines are that are portrayed in the monuments. So there were Russians around, and Russians came into our line from time to time to find out things that we were doing, and we sent people over to see what they were doing. But there were never any Russians at all, I'll say. And the story also actually loses a chance to show you one of the most gorgeous little skiing and hiking villages you could possibly imagine. There's about 150 square miles of that area that are loaded with salt, which at one time, in many places, was equal to the price of gold in terms of its weight. It was a nice source of income. So the old Holy Roman emperors, who go clear back into the 1100s and the 1200s, restricted that, just like it was a national forest. And only the people who actually lived there and worked in the mines or worked as hunting guides and that sort of thing could live up there. Inadvertently, they just preserved the whole thing so it could now be a modern ski resort, and you can drive in there. And some of those gorgeous country, and everything is park-like. The meadows are all mowed every day by the resident cattle who live out there. The thing looks just like an advertisement, and it's absolutely gorgeous. And so are the other little Austrian villages around it. That, it would be hard to portray. So there's some sort of phony scene where there's some shooting at the entrance to the mine, never happened. The Russians are in danger of coming to the mine, never happened. The funniest thing to me, thinking about the ruttered old road, which is like going up on some mountain road in the Olympics now, where there's a Russian convoy gets attacked, defending the approaches to Aldous. The road is paved. I can tell you it wasn't paved. I think 45. What kind of stuff got in the mine? Well, that's why I passed around some of this. There's about 10,000 items. And there's all sorts of figures, and somewhere I've given you a schedule just exactly what the German count was. About 5,000 or 6,000 paintings and pieces of sculpture, and about 4,000 or 5,000 pieces of precious art of one kind or another, designs of one thing or another. Two of the most important of these pieces of art, one is painting. And the school of painting goes back to just about 1500 to about 1600 or so, and it's kind of post-Renaissance. And you can take the Renaissance, famous Renaissance of the 13th century, and you get a much more vigorous one in the Renaissance of the 15th century, in the early 1600s and so on. And that spread into Europe, and then spread north and west, went on to England and so on. All of that led to essentially a lowlands, low in the sense of literally the flatness of the country, the places in Holland and Belgium, tiny bits of Luxembourg, that sort of thing, with a marvelous school of art that produced people like Rembrandt. And they were interested in the light, with an enormously beautiful light, on the sunny days. It's like living in Seattle. It's either good or bad, but it's always interesting. The good light, and also the darkness. If you think about some of the Rembrandt portraits, there's an enormous amount of black or dark background. And then you get the vision the artist wants you to have, the eye of the beholder, seeing the night watch, or whatever it is. And that school of art was really, really skilled at this. Anyway, a lot of their stuff and a lot of other really good stuff got picked up by these Nazi confiscation crews that were running around, and they were putting it everywhere they possibly could. The most famous of all of the, and the most highly critical probably, of all of the mines was this village of Aldous in the Salzkammergut. My division happened to be up in that area at the end of the war, and Major Pearson, who's mentioned in the movie, as I recall, and certainly mentioned in all the books that deal with this, from a sister regiment. I was in the 319th, he was from the 318th Infantry Regiment, was the first one in there. And the people in Aldous, the miners and so on, got to talking about this and took him up there and made sure that he saw it in Silman. Then, as things go, the 318th was in that area just briefly, and then they were replaced by my 319th Infantry Regiment. And I had belonged to a special unit which dealt with the fact, first of all, we had these 57mm guns, which really weren't very good, but they decided to break up my company in December of 1944, just before the Bulge started, on the 16th of December of 44. They broke up the company, and they sent most of them into either rifle or weapons company. There was a favored few, and I think my numbers show about 50, an officer and some tech sergeants and one master sergeant, as I recall. And the rest of us were just rifle guys, and we were sent with 3 of those guns to theoretically protect regimental headquarters, or place the guns anywhere a regiment thought that they would work. And the rest of us then were to pull guard around the regimental headquarters, which is really cushy duty, and very safe ordinarily, or to run combat and recon patrols behind the German line. And I've done that over and over. I found out about Hitler's death on the 12th of April, 1945, Hitler's death, Roosevelt's death. I was coming back in either on the 12th or the 13th from one of those patrols, and we passed an American tank. They had 3 or 4 different kinds of radio capability. And one of them was just simply listening to a news broadcast from Paris, probably, from SHAPE headquarters. And they told us as we passed the tank that Mr. Roosevelt had died. We had been out doing some crazy thing, shooting at somebody about something, or just looking to see what was going on out beyond the lines. There's a note in here, and I didn't even attempt to explain it. The group was called the Ranger Platoon, and the notion that they were Rangers is absolutely stupid. We got a lot of teasing about that, but I really didn't mind the teasing. It was better than being in a rifle company or a heavy weapons company, where the great percentage of all casualties, killed, wounded, injured, and so on, takes place in those rifle companies. And you have 15,500 men in the Second World War Infantry Division in the United States. We had over 15,000 casualties, and none of those took place in the regimental headquarters company, as far as I know. I was pleased to be where I was. It was bad enough, dangerous, but also exciting. I have one line to my parents when I wrote, it was some shooting patrol. It was dangerous, but it was kind of fun. It was dangerous. As far as the mine is concerned, that was blocked by the miners. They had a very controlled explosion that they set up that blocked an area just about as long as from this end of the room to the other end of the room, with a whole bunch of falling rock, and it's in the German where they call it make it shiver. And then they just made a lot of the rock on the tunnel fall in and block the tunnel. And that kept the local Nazi department or area leader, departmental area in German is a Gau, and the leader is a Leiter, L-E-I-T-E-R. The Gauleiter was a hotshot Nazi, and he wanted to blow up the mine, and everything in it, destroy the whole thing. And the miners thought, there's not that much skiing around here. This mine is all we've got. On top of that, you can also see that a lot of them had enough sense to realize that you shouldn't blow up all that art that's back in there. So they blew up the mine entrance, and it took almost a week after the war was over to open the mine. So Major Pearson and his group left. My group came in. We were sent up there because we didn't have any more combat patrols to run, and that's how I got to be in the movie. Actually, I'm not in the movie, nor should I be. I was just another GI with a rifle. But it was a privilege to be there, in part because we vaguely knew how important some of this stuff was. And there's one of the, two of the art objects are in some of this material that Mike has set up for you. One of them is part of the triptych, or the painted panels for the Ghent Cathedral. Now that would be, actually that would extend from about here to over as far as Jay and Mike. It was big enough paintings, like the screens on the wall, so you could see them as you were sitting in the back of the cathedral. They'd be up on the front, on the altar. And they would ordinarily be folded, sort of like one of these folding screens you could get, and they'd be in 3. So you get a try, you get triptych pictures, and they were painted by some of the most famous of all of the people in that lowlands of Belgian and Dutch Renaissance. That was there. And then the other one that I think you should take a look at, and I showed some pictures here, and Mike has set up for you. The Bruges Madonna. She's by Michelangelo. And take a look at her and at the Christ child. First of all, Michelangelo absolutely insisted that this was not to leave Italy. Some rich burgher, if you will, in Belgium managed to buy the thing and smuggle it out of Italy. And it's just been the centerpiece. It's the Seahawks of Bruges. They're really interested and really proud, and the Ghent altarpiece, the Ghent people in Ghent wanted it back that summer of '45 so that they could celebrate it. And the Bruges Madonna, they wanted her back. Take a look at her, because the way in which she is portrayed, the bodies, the figures, the faces and everything is very interesting. If you think about the carving, the sculpting on a Gothic cathedral, ordinarily is part of the long pillars, which are part of the long, narrow, slender, very graceful pillars. Well, it's almost impossible for the sculptor to work a bunch of fat people in. So you don't really have, so far as I can recall, any fat figures anywhere on any Gothic cathedral I can remember. They're all tall and slender. They all look like a pillar. And they're skinny, and that's the way that these things were portrayed with the Gothic. There's something of that still in the painting that you see in the Ghent altarpiece. The figures there are not full figures. The figures for the Bruges Madonna are very interesting in terms of simply sculpture. Look at, first of all, at Mary's face. And you look at that, and you look at her mouth. A beautifully formed mouth, and her lips are sort of pursed. That's straight out of Vogue magazine. That's photography every day in modern modeling, period here. You wouldn't have found that before, much before this. This is a completely different, new kind of world that Michelangelo was portraying. And also, she's a very interesting looking woman, even though she's supposed to be a very young woman. And then when you look at the Christ, that's very nicely done also. It's beautifully done. And then the interaction between the two figures is fabulous. And just to point out, that's one of the things that's back in the mind. When the Nazis stole that, they put it on some sort of cart, took it out, put it on a truck, and in order to cushion the truck, they stole a mattress from some house and put that in the truck, and then put the Bruges Madonna, which you can see there, down on that. And 8 months later in the mine, she was still on probably the same damn mattress, it was wet. And it was just lying there. And that's the world in which monuments men work. And I had nothing to do with this, although we stood guard on the entrance to the cave. And then we patrolled the mine, all of the chambers, wherever the paintings and the sculpture were stored, and the famous books and so on. And we patrolled that constantly, rifle loaded, because there was a thought that the SS and maybe some other Germans would stay in the war, keep the war going in what they call a redoubt up there, and that was an article of faith for a while. The redoubt disappeared about 20 minutes after the war ended, but it took us a long time to realize that. The Germans realized that they had not just lost the war, they had really lost the war. You would have to be in Germany to realize how destroyed that thing was. And I'm not sure how many German soldiers said, let's go up and have a redoubt. But I'll bet their wives said, we've had just enough redoubts. No more redoubts, guys. Just come home and start rebuilding this place. And they did. With that, I'll shush up.
You talked about rifling through Rembrandt's. So
Oh,
you were
if you look at the pictures there, I think in one of them, you can see there's some racks behind the workers who are looking at the Ghent triptych and all the things. And it was just like racks that you would display, where you would display cheap painting or posters over in the bookstore. And so, and they would be just about this high. And then there'd be another layer of those. And so you could go along and you'd pull these, it's interesting to think about it. Large bombers will kill you if you get anywhere near one of those in the British Museum. You pull these back, and our high school would say, okay, who was Rembrandt? You know? And none of us did, of course. Hey, you know the guy who had famous painting that Sister told you to learn about in the 8th grade. So you go through these, and my all-time great line, I may have quoted it here, I'm not quite sure. I wrote home to my parents and I said, I saw some very good Rembrandts today. I have spent a lifetime telling students that story because it just illustrates how ignorant we really were. You know, I'm not sure what a very good Rembrandt is. Anyway, the stuff was there. The most interesting, because I could type, I was pulled off guard duty a lot of times when I was typing what in the freight business where I grew up, we call the manifest, but it was just a statement. This is what's on the boat, this is what's on the truck. We were sending this stuff down to Munich, which is a story in itself because we'd blown Munich to pieces. So where did you find an intact building? They managed to do so, and I've got a picture of it there somewhere in those photographs. The most interesting thing I can remember typing was not the Ken Older piece. It's 3 or 4 small silver Australian coins. How they got there, what German decided to save those, I have no idea, but they were in one of these cases. We also had, for those of you who've done Anthro and done your History 101, we had those little 3-inch high figurines, fertility figurines from, what is it, 7 or 8, 10,000 years ago, the Willendorf goddesses. They're from the Natural History Museum, which is really the History Museum in Vienna. And so we had the little Willendorf goddesses there at the mine in Alsace. I never saw those. A lot of stuff I didn't see. And a lot of stuff I saw they had no idea what I was seeing and didn't understand at all. The other comment I guess I could say was the reading. Anybody else on anything else? Yes, Steve.
The movie showed that there were several mines where art was being stored, and one in particular where they did in fact torch it in advance. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, it's at Siegen. There's only about 2 or 3 even halfway decent rivers, only one really, in Germany that went east to west. If you think about it, Germany is a creation of the glacier period, and all the rivers run south to north, and they all exit out into the Channel or into the North Sea, into the Baltic Sea. So you get the Oder and so on coming from the west, starting with the Meers, and then the Rhine, which actually ended out through Holland and so on. There's about 4 of those valleys. In opposite Köln, Cologne, if you will, you'll see a little river running, it's only this big on your map, east and west. It's the Sieg, the word victory. I don't know why they used it, but they did it a long time ago. Thanks, Mike. S-I-E-G, the Sieg River, and the little town is Siegen. And you remember they talk over and over about Siegen, and everybody thinks, I'm supposed to learn this in geography, and they never really tell you. Anyway, that's in the picture, and that had an awful lot of the really good stuff. One more thing about the Germans that you won't hear, by the way, and it's not in any of these books. The Germans had a plan to reproduce, counterfeit, British 5-pound notes at the end of the war. A movie's been written about that, or made about this, by the way, very good. And then, to do that, they took a bunch of Jewish, not counterfeiters, but engravers from Amsterdam, where there'd been a block of these people, and were in concentration camp. They pulled all the survivors together and told them, okay, we might let you live, we want these perfect British 5-pound notes, and they came close to it. But that counterfeiting operation came so close at the end of the war that they never had time to put them into circulation. Being the Germans that they were, they thought, well, maybe somehow these will be useful. So in the last days of the war, when people are dying simply trying to find a crust of bread, and there's no gasoline, they mount up a convoy of 4 or 5 heavy trucks, load all the presses, God knows what they did with the poor Jewish engravers, all the counterfeit money and all the good money that they used as models, and drove it all the way south and west, out of Berlin, down to Alsace. Right next door to the Alsace Lake there, and near a little town called Bad Alsace, is another lake, which is one of the deepest in Europe, and it's some 900 feet deep. And it's about shaped just about like this room, only still on its end. And it really goes down steeply. And there had been a German base there where they were experimenting with various things connected with submarines. They had these nice quarters, You walk 20 feet out on the dock and it's 800 feet down. So they did all sorts of research there, and that's probably why they came there. But they had this convoy coming across Germany. Germany is dying. There's British and American planes shooting up every vehicle that moves, but the convoy gets all the way down almost to my little village there in Alsace, and then just about that time the war ends. So the Germans realize this is going to happen. So they take all these plates and all this money and walk out on the dock at this little lake and dump it overboard, 900 feet down. People are still scuba diving down there or whatever you would do trying to find that. And it used to be, it's no longer true. But on all my previous visits, I think up until just a few years ago, you'd hear reports that every once in a while at night there'd be mysterious shootings over there. People, who knows what's going on at the lake. So far as I know, the plates have never been recovered, but it makes a great story. So it's another thought about hiring one kind of, in that case, counterfeit money, as well as all those plates down there in that lake. So someday on your summer vacation, try if you can go down that far. Anybody else?
Was there ever a sense of how much art was lost? Was there ever an inventory to prove?
Pardon?
Was there ever a sense of how much art was lost?
No, it's hard to do an inventory. It's very hard to do an inventory about what was saved. Art collectors are some of the most secretive people in the world. Some of them don't want the public to know what they've got because they don't know the provenance, the source of the ownership. I think Hitler signed for almost everything he stole. It's all legal. It's like that wonderful 19th century American economist or businessman who said, I seen my chances and I took them. That's what Hitler did. There's a lot that's missing and we don't know where it is, a lot of argument. Some of the art that we had in the cave, I think, was stolen. I'm not sure that I can't insist it was stolen from our cave there in Steinberg. There's a known case, complete with court-martial records, for an Army officer and his girlfriend, who was also an Army officer, who were stationed in a castle supposed to be guarding some of this stuff, and they stole something. A whole truckload went to Italy. If you've been in Italian traffic, you know you can't figure out where that could possibly have gone to. It may still be stalled somewhere in Florence. Anyway, that all disappeared. Why, we don't know, and who's got it, we don't know. But it's just unnamed stuff. In the notes that I gave you, there's some guy who made a collection of Nazi posters. Turned that over to the government in Germany, I think it was, and the German government won't give it back to them. And this stuff just goes on and on and on and on. So yeah, there's a lot of it missing and never will be found. The worst story about far as destruction is concerned, that the Germans got really tired of the fact that the Allies had 2 or 3 aircraft that were really good at coming in low and strafing, machine gunning local traffic, or cattle, or ice cream dealers, or whatever happened to be on the street. And so they built a bunch of what were called flag towers, and flag towers looked like big chimneys. Only they were big enough at the top to have a fairly decent-sized anti-aircraft gun on them. Now, I started seeing those in Normandy in August of '44, and they go to march right across Europe. There were a bunch of those in Berlin, where they certainly had a good use for them. One of those had been turned into, because they're multi-level, had been turned into an art repository, just like my mine at Alsace. And so they had an unnamed, unnumbered amount of treasures in there. They didn't have any records of it. They just knew there were a lot of valuable paintings and God knows what else. And after 2 or 3 days after the Russians got there, and there was a lot of looting, a lot of displaced persons, everybody doing the looting, somebody finally set fire to the bottom of this particular tower. I think I've named it somewhere in my notes for you. And all the art just disappeared. We don't know what was there. We know that just people said that there were hundreds and hundreds of valuable pieces of art, valuable books and so on, all gone. No one has any records, so a lot of this just disappeared. Part of it is, I think, simply, my interest comes from just simply art as an expression of a society. It's very good about either predicting where the society is going, or saying something about what it is right now, or reflecting the past, depending on the artist's view of what he or she wants to portray, and also depending on the viewer. But a lot of this stuff is so marvelously symbolic. Many of the engravings there were Dürer's engravings. Remember, he's got the praying hands. All you see is the hands. But you understand from the picture, you know what hands are in terms of this shape. This is prayer, especially in a Roman Catholic world, which that was. And art has all those symbols. So it's hard to decide what is art, but whatever was in that tower, no matter what it was, is gone. It's probably, oh, we've got a few minutes yet. I have a few minutes if you want to talk. Anybody else got a good, yes?
So, I saw in your notes that you never took anything. If you had, what would be the process to get it back home with you if you wanted to? Was that hard to get it through as a soldier and be able to keep it?
The problem was that stealing stuff and sending it back home could either be very simple or very complicated. For instance, I have stuff, not that I stole, but some 40 pieces of absolutely beautiful china that were given to me by a German woman in Czechoslovakia in the fall of '45. And she was told, you own a hotel and you've been here for your family for 200 years, but you and the rest of you are going back to Germany, and each of you can take what you can take in 2 suitcases. She could not take the hotel in two suitcases. So we were, my little platoon was living in this hotel. She thought we were just great people. She called us in and she said, you can have anything in the hotel that you can send home. And so I had a metal box, which I still have about this big. The Germans in a manufacturing plant had been using to hold the pistols which would be used by the guards overseeing the slave laborers there. And I found that on a patrol, and my, again, association with the anti-tank people, this wonderful truck, put the whole damn thing on the truck. And it had about 50 pistols in it, so I was giving pistols to everybody around. And finally, took that box and filled it with these plates and sent it to my parents. And she said, the lady who owns it, said, you're going to want some really good packing for these. The upstairs is full of mattresses. I don't want the Czechs to get the mattresses. Upstairs is just horsehair mattresses. Horsehair is nice and springy. And so to make a long story short, Sergeant Gorna, whom I still remember, and I got together, and one of us, we were both strong men, we pushed these as hard as we could, and the other pushed the sort of horsehair in there. One plate out of about 50 broke. Got home. So you could send them home that way. On the other hand, you never knew what they would do at one of these discharge centers like Camp Kilmer or Fort Lewis. You never knew what sort of shakedown, they called it, inspection there would be, where you did everything down to your skivvy. And nobody wanted to be held in the Army any longer than you wanted to. So people tried to smuggle things, but it ordinarily was simply not a good idea. Couldn't do it. The mail sent those dishes home. I still have a little shipping certificate signed by Lieutenant so-and-so that this is what's in there. He didn't know. He had no idea, and he didn't care. We told him it was dishes, and home they came. It could have been atomic bombs if the Germans had. You have no idea how amateur so much of what we did was. Especially this is because my heart really resides here with the maintenance people. I realize what experts really are. I realize just how amateurish we really were. We were good at a lot of things. The reason I was in that special company was 2 things. It's one thing to be able to shoot, which I can still do. In terms of Dr. Kuntz's profession, will you shoot? That's the difference. And will you shoot carefully and accurately? There's a big difference in those 2 things. You just never knew what was going to be successful, in other words, in trying to smuggle stuff home. And I think the simplest thing to do is to not smuggle it home is to simply marry a German girl. That's probably the most forthright thing you could possibly do. Anybody else on anything else? Well, thank you very much. I enjoyed talking about it. I'm pleased you saw the movie. I think the movie does a good job, and frankly, I think we did a good job. I should add that my sister-in-law, who's very proper Italian, expert on art, could not believe that even though we were guarding that mine, and charged with securing it, that we were, quote, actually allowed to touch the, it was just via tato, just absolutely forbidden as far as she was concerned. I told her, no, we thumb through this stuff every day. Oh, I've got a great story. Most of you won't know what a carbide lamp is, but it's a little lamp that looks pretty much like a tuna fish can, and it's in two pieces. One of them has carbide in it, and the other has a little water. You mix the two of those together, and you get a gas, which is flammable. And it's been used as miners' lamps for hundreds and hundreds of years. So we had those for light, and because I told you the miners blew up the entrance to the mine, they also blew all the switches that carry electricity in there. So we were using these little lamps when we were back there. The little lamps not only generate the gas, which has a flame to it, if you inadvertently tip it a little bit, a drop of water together with gas, flaming, will drop out. None of us, so far as I know, ever dropped a flaming drop of carbide gas lamp on any one of those paintings, but I think back about it now, it could have happened. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you.